I think we're ready. Oh, good evening, everybody. I should say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today to listen to my talk. I'm delighted to be involved in the Migration Matters Festival. I've always been an ardent supporter, and it's amazing that this year it's going online. But of course, since it's online, it's a first for all of us, including myself. This is my first online webinar, so I hope I'll be able to manage technologically. That's the challenge. This talk, which I'm going to give today, is concerning two Indian migrant women. And all of you will be familiar with the title of my presentation, which is about Indian migrant women, their contribution to Britain, in particular, the suffragette movement and World War II. Now, why am I talking about these two women, and who are these two women that I'm talking about? In particular, I'm focusing on Sophia Dulip Singh, and who was a suffragette, and Noor Inayat Khan, who was a secret agent in the Second World War. Now, what's interesting about my talk is that, as we've seen from the recent protests following George Floyd's death, the anti-racist protests, there's a lot of concern that there are a lot of hidden histories. We don't know about the contribution of a large number of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. And indeed, I myself didn't know very much about the two women, even though I have a doctorate in social anthropology, I've done postdoctoral work, I've done research on colonialism, particularly Portuguese colonialism, but also covering also covering British colonialism. Although these were several years ago, nevertheless, I only came across these two women by chance. About 3 years ago, I came across a book written by Anita Anand, who is the presenter on television, and she wrote a book about Sophia. And last year, I was involved in the music festival, and one of my English colleagues was doing some research on music history and came across the story of Noor and her father, who is a very famous musician. So even people like myself might be unaware of a lot of our background, a lot of our heritage. And this airbrushing of history, which is so common and so evident, has been talked about a lot more now by various people in the last few years. And it's really only in the last few years that books have been written, such as the one by Anita Anand on Sophia, the book by Shabrani Basu about Noor. You will have seen David Olusoga on television quite a lot. You will have heard about Shashi Thakur, who's also written about colonialism, Sumita Mukherjee, and all these references are in a list that's going to be put up on the chat for you. So I'm going to be talking for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes to illuminate, to make visible these histories, which have been hidden for a large number of years, the contribution to the empire, for example, even in the world wars, when a large number of Indian and African troops were brought to work from the colonies to help with the war effort. We don't hear very much about them at all. With all the centenary celebrations, ceremonials, they're rarely acknowledged. So let's now look at the two women in more detail. And I'm going to start with talking about Sophia. And Sophia Dulip Singh, as I mentioned, was a suffragette. Now, all of you, I'm sure, will have heard about the suffragette movement. Two very well-known women, Emmeline Pankhurst, her memorial, her statue is in Victoria Gardens, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett, whose statue was unveiled fairly recently in Parliament Square. Now, Millicent Garrett Fawcett was the person who started with the suffragist movement. Now, the suffragists believed in non-violent campaigning. So they lobbied MPs, that kind of activity. But a lot of women, including Emmeline Pankhurst, got a little bit frustrated with the lack of progress that was made. And so the suffragists emerged. And she was a leading figure amongst the suffragettes. And as you probably know, they were involved in more militant action. For them, it was deeds, not words, that were more important. And for them, various activities that drew attention to what they were doing was important. Now, some of you will have seen the film called The Suffragette, where this is brought quite graphically to the screen, the arson attacks, the bombing, the marches, lots of marches taking place, women being arrested, being brutalized, the very famous Black Friday in November 1910, on the 18th of November, when a march was taking place and women were brutalized by the police. There's echoes of what's happening nowadays. And many of them were also arrested. Now, amongst those women was Sophia Dulip Singh, an Indian woman, actually the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. And she was involved in all the activities with the suffragettes. And we can see here that she was involved, for example, I'm going to show you a picture of her involved in, in the horse-drawn carriages that went around London, promoting the cause of the suffragettes. And there she is in the hat, taking this cart around London with all the slogans, drawing attention to the movement. And there she is, if we see again, she's selling a paper called the Suffragette. Interesting enough, this is just outside Hampton Court, where she actually lived. Now, Hampton Court Palace, many of you will know, is still very famous till today and was one of the royal palaces. So there was Sophia, involved in these activities, involved in refusing to pay her tax, as a lot of the suffragettes did. And they said, well, you know, if there is, we are not going to pay tax if there is no representation. So no tax, no representation. The census forms that were meted out in 1911, a very comprehensive census was being undertaken at the time. And the suffragettes, including Sophia, refused to sign them. Women don't count. Why should we be counted? They said. And so there was lots of these activities taking place. But while a lot of suffragettes were thrown into prison, were imprisoned, and even though Sophia did actually go to court to protest about, which was asked to pay taxes, she was never thrown into prison. She didn't participate in the hunger strikes, but she wasn't thrown into prison. So why was this? Why did she not get meted out the same type of punishment, if you like? And the reason is that Sophia was the daughter of Dulip Singh, and here he is. And who was Dulip Singh? Well, Dulip Singh was Sophia's father, and Sophia's grandfather was Ranjit Singh. Now, Ranjit Singh was to the Punjab. He was known as the Lion of Punjab. Punjab's northwest of India. It was a very attractive area full of resources, and he ruled, was a very well-respected ruler of that kingdom. Now, at the time, the British were represented by the East India Company, and the East India Company had their eye on the Punjab because it was such a resourceful place. When Ranjit Singh dies in 1839, Dulip was only a year old, and there was a hiatus in terms of who was going to succeed Ranjit. And in that period, when there was a lot of toing and froing amongst different Sikh groups to take over, the East India Company saw a chance to move in, and they took over the lands. And they installed Dulip, who's only about 5 years old at the time, as the boy king, saying that when he reaches the age of 16, they would return the lands to him, but they didn't. They exiled him. At first, he was taken to live with an English family and became a proper English boy. He learned to speak English. He learned to wear Western clothes. He shaved off his hair. Now, if any of you know about the Sikh religion, the long hair is a very important symbol of Sikhism, but his hair was cut. And he converted to Christianity. Now, Queen Victoria heard about him, getting messages about him, and he was exiled at the age of 15 to England. And he went to Queen Victoria's court. And there he was with her family, spending a lot of time with them. She was very much impressed with him and very keen to have him in the court. And Queen Victoria, apparently, and Dulip Singh used to sketch each other a lot. Now, some of you might have heard about her fascination with India. Now, she didn't actually go to live in India, but India came to her in a sense. And one of the things that came to her was this. If you look at her neck, the necklace on her neck is the very famous Kohinoor diamond, a very wonderful 160-carat diamond that was taken from the Punjab and brought to Britain. And Queen Victoria wore it on many, many ceremonial occasions. And it is still in the crown jewels in the Tower of London. So Queen Victoria became Empress of India around the same time as Sophia was born. And Sophia became her goddaughter. She was very much enthralled by this young girl. And she was brought up as a thoroughly English girl, a very aristocratic girl. She became a fashionista. She used to wear Western clothes. She was always in the papers. She was in the social scene. She was even a debutante. Some of you will know about this tradition that existed in England whereby young girls of aristocratic background were presented to the Queen. And there she was, age 19, presented to the Queen as a debutante. Was given a Grace and Favour house in Hampton Court Palace, and that's where she lived. So she participated a great deal in this aristocratic scene. But what happened? Why did she become a suffragette? And the clue lies in her visits to India. Around 1903 and again in 1906, she went to visit India. And when she visited India, she was absolutely surprised by what she saw. She had obviously been sold a narrative in the past about how wonderful the British were in India and how good they were to India. But when she went there, she saw the streets of Lahore with all the deprivation, the poverty. She saw the villages of India, where you can see the women here in the villages. She also noticed that all her land, she saw the lands from her family that had been taken away. She also was part of the aristocratic scene amongst the British elite in India, but she was snubbed by them many a time. All these experiences, together with, very interesting enough, she met Indian nationalists. At the time, there was a lot of ferment going on in India, political turbulence. There were talks about, nationalism, and she met very important men and women who were involved in the nationalist movement, who were talking about, freedom. We want to be able to represent ourselves. We want self-determination. And when she went back to England, she found there was a resonance with this message with the suffragettes. She also came across the Lascars, who were Indian sailors, and she saw how they were being treated when they were in Britain. But as part of the aristocratic scene that she was involved in, she met some suffragettes, and there were quite a few women from that background who were suffragettes. And she saw that this was her cause. She became passionately involved. She was part of the inner circle with Emmeline Pankhurst. On the Black Friday March, she was amongst the 9 of them that actually went to the Houses of Parliament. So she was very much part of the inner circle of Emmeline Pankhurst, very much involved in the suffragette movement. As you know, the suffragettes eventually in 1928 were given equal franchise. Now, the suffragette movement in Britain always had an imperial arm to it. The marches always had an empire section where women from India, Australia, the other colonies marched together. But India itself did not achieve equal votes for women until independence in 1947. Sophia continued to be involved with the suffragettes, and in fact was part of the fellowship of the suffragettes. And here she is seen at a suffragette dinner in 1937. So she was still part of the fellowship, but then, of course, things had quietened down. And she died in 1948. Now, she returned to her religion of Sikhism. She wanted to be cremated, and she was cremated. And she wanted her ashes taken back to ancestral lands. And in 1949, her sister took her ashes and were laid to rest in her ancestral lands. And so that is the story of Sophia. And it's really interesting that here we have an Indian woman of a princess who was involved in the suffragette movement, but so rarely do we hear about her contribution to the cause. And I hope this has given you some insight into her. I'm now going to move swiftly on to the next person I'm going to talk about, which is Noor Inayat Khan. And as I say, the references you have, you'll be able to look into greater detail about their backgrounds. Now, Noor Inayat Khan was also of a princess, and her background is interesting. She was actually the descendant of Tipu Sultan, who was known as the Tiger of Mysore. Mysore was another princely state in India. And several generations later, her own father, Hasrat Khan, was a very well-known musician in India. And as I say, I got to know about this family because of the interest I have in music and some work I was doing last year. And Hasrat Khan, her father, in the 1920s, went touring with a band of musicians, playing instruments, including the veena, which is a very famous Indian instrument. And when he was in America in the 1920s, he met his American wife and they got married. They moved over to Europe, where he gave concerts. And in 1914, Noor was born in Moscow. The family, however, moved to live in France. Although they spent a few years in London, they actually they moved to France. And they lived in a suburb not very far from Paris. And they set up a home there. And here you can see a picture of the family. The very grand-looking man is her father, Hasrat Inayat Khan. There's her mother and her brothers and sisters and her uncles in the background. And here Noor was brought up, was educated in France. She also learned to play a range of instruments. And here we can see her playing an Indian instrument called the veena. Now, what's also interesting is that her father started performing far less. What he became very interested in was to set up the Sufi movement in the West. Now, some of you are probably familiar with Sufism. It's a form of Islamic spiritualism. Some of you in the West particularly might have heard of Rumi, the well-known poet and philosopher who was born in 13th century, lived in 13th century Turkey. His works tend to be quite well known in the West. But the type of Sufism that Hasrat Inayat Khan, Noor's father, set up was a more eclectic version, where he combined Indian universal truths with the West's concerned with self-improvement, self-development. And he thought that this particular version of Sufism would be of greater interest to the West, and people would join the Sufi movement. Now, his house in Paris, in Surennes, was teeming with people coming in, Sufis. He talked a lot, and Noor was brought up in this atmosphere. In the mid-1920s, her father decided to go back to India, and very sadly, he died there in 1927. The family were left behind in France. And in 1940, the German guns were pointing at France. And the family were deciding what should they do. In particular, Noor and her brother Vilayat were debating, what should we do? On the one hand, Sufism preaches nonviolence. And they've been brought up by their father who talked about Gandhi. and the nationalist movement in India and the civil disobedience and non-violence that he promoted. But on the other hand, they said, how can we just sit back and do nothing? How can we just talk about spirituality when the guns are pointing, when there's death, destruction going on during the war? We need to do something. And so they decided to move to England. And that's how they came to be in England. And their mother and sister Claire came with them to England. And her brother William joined the services. And Noor decided to become a nurse. A lot of women joined the nursing profession at the time. And so Noor was involved in nursing. But Noor was actually wanted to be involved far more in something more important. She wanted something more challenging. And she joined, as we saw in the photograph right at the beginning, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And she trained as a radio operator. Now, this is a picture here of Beulah Manor in the New Forest in England. And this is a training school for agents. So this is where they were trained in how to use their transmitters. Now, Noor seemed to have a particular aptitude for military radio operations. And she came to the attention of the Special Operations Executive. Now, this had been set up in 1940, particularly because of the war effort, to sabotage the German war effort, to engage in espionage, to engage in reconnaissance. And Noor was recruited by them to work with them. They knew she had very good linguistic skills. She had French, she had English. And so she was sent to Paris in June 1943 to join the resistance movement there and to help with the agents who were operating in Paris. At the time, quite a number of agents had actually been captured by the Germans. And Noor was offered the opportunity to go back to England, but she refused. She felt that she could really make a contribution. And so she got involved in various activities that the secret agents were involved in. She was helping the supply of arms, with supply drops, with helping Allied wounded soldiers to escape and to be sent back to England. And of course, she was transmitting messages. And at one time, she was the only secret agent left in Paris. She refused to return. She continued. And she knew it was dangerous because if I show you the next photograph, these are the transmitters that were used for sending messages. Now, this is nothing like the more modern equipment, as you can see, as you probably know. And she was carrying these around in suitcases, in a suitcase. She had to move from one area to the other because the Germans could locate where she was. And to escape capture, she moved around to different locations. She even went back to Suriname, but couldn't go to her own home because that was occupied by the Germans. And she tried to escape detection by changing the way she looked. She wore different clothes. She tried to dress like a French woman so that they wouldn't be able to detect her. But not only was there the danger of the Germans, there was also danger within the resistance movement because there were double agents. And double agents, what they do, of course, is they're collecting the information what's going on with the British secret agents and then telling the Germans. So she had to be very careful about that as well. It's very difficult to know who it was, who were the double agents. So she'd be very careful about how she went about doing things. Even her messages are sent to her family. Now, her family didn't know that she was involved as a secret agent. None of them knew that she was involved in that. And so she had to be very careful about what she did. And unfortunately, she was captured by the Germans. Now, it is thought that maybe some in the resistance movement, one of the double agents, tipped off the Germans and she was captured. And she was captured in September 1943, and October 1943. And the Germans interrogated her, but she refused to divulge any information. she was sent to the prison in Fosheim, which is in southwestern Germany. And there she was tortured. She was kept in solitary confinement. She had chains put upon her. She was chained. She was put on minimal rations. Still, she refused to divulge the information. She was tight-lipped. And she even garnered respect of the Germans. They said they couldn't believe that this woman was so steadfast in not divulging any kind of information about what she was involved in. And the Germans then, after she spent quite a long time, 11 months in the prison, then sent her to Dachau, together with some other women. And this is, of course, where the concentration camp was. And some of you might have seen a picture of this. This is a picture of the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. And here she was at the concentration camp. And again, there were attempts to get her to divulge information, but she was not prepared to divulge any kind of information at all. 3 other women were shot, and she was still, attempts were still being made to get her to divulge information, but she didn't. And eventually, she was shot, executed by the Germans on the 14th of November in 1944. And the tragedy was, she was only 30 years old. And when she was shot, she cried out, "Liberté!" Freedom. And there we have it. She was killed there. And if I show you the next slide, which shows you the memorial that is now to be found at Dachau to her. And you can see the name Madeleine used there. And Madeleine was the name that was given to her by the French. That was the name she was known in the resistance movement. So how do we remember her? Do we know anything about her? Well, interesting enough, the French were very proud of her. The French have commemorated her far more. She immediately in 1946 got the Croix de Guerre, which is a very famous award. There is a special square in Suriname where her family lived and where she lived, which is named after Madeleine. And on Bastille Day in July, the military band marches in memory of her. But what about Britain? How do we remember her in Britain? Well, she did get the George Cross in 1949, which is the second highest honor given to people who are heroic in the face of tremendous dangers. So she was recognized for one of the few people, I should say, because there were a large number, as I've mentioned earlier, of Indians, of Black people who were involved in the war effort, but who are not commemorated and not celebrated. But she was then. But not very much else. She was in oblivion for a very long time. But fortunately, in 2006, a journalist and a writer, Shahini Basu, published a book called The Spy Princess, which told the story of Noor. And it's one of the books I've put in the reference that you might like to read. And Shahini Basu was very much prominent in trying to get Noor recognized much more for her achievement. Such a brave woman involved in such dangerous activity, made such a big contribution to the war effort. And eventually, and very fortunately, in 2012, a memorial, a bust of Noor, is unveiled in Gordon Square Gardens. Gordon Square Gardens was where Safa used to go and sit down. She lived very nearby, and she would go and sit there and meditate. And this was a very fitting place for a memorial to her. And there we see Princess Anne, who actually unveiled the memorial. And the woman in the sari is the author I just mentioned. And this was attended by over 450 people. dignitaries from this country, from India, from different parts of the world, who were there to honor Noor for her contribution to Britain. And more recently, in 2018, there has been a big campaign at the time when the new £50 note was going to be released. And this campaign was to have Noor to be the face on the £50 note. And even though ministers backed this, sadly, this campaign was not successful. And as you probably all know, Alan Turin is the face on the £50 note. Had she been on the £50 note, she would have been the first person from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background who has been so commemorated. So there is work to be done to bring her story better known to the public. And I hope today, with this brief, and in fact, very brief canter to the two stories of Sophia Dilip Singh and Noor Inayat Khan, I've at least unveiled a hidden history of two very important women, Indian women, migrants to Britain, who have made a tremendous contribution, which needs wider recognition. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to have any questions. I think Susanna has been taking questions in the chat forum, and I think she's going to tell me what they are. So thank you very much for listening. So Susanna, I'm all yours.
Thank you so much, Stella. That was absolutely fascinating. What two incredibly brave and outstanding women. Thank you. I do have a couple of questions for you, actually. And lots of chat coming through saying thank you, and that was amazing. So my first question is there any evidence of the achievements of these two women being taught in any curriculums, either in school or in university here? Or is that another hidden history?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because as you know, with the Black Lives Movement, there has been a lot of talk about hidden histories. And one of the recommendations in the protest marches has been for the curriculum to be broadened, for the curriculum of empire, of colonialism to be included, more modern histories to be included. And as you saw, even just recently, I think there was some young people or alumni from public schools who said that the history that they'd heard, they'd been taught, did not cover any of this. So there is a definite need. I'm not aware of anything, but what's very interesting, there are a number of new books that have come out now, which give a more balanced view about empire, about colonialism, which redresses some of the balances and redresses the dominant narrative, which has been how wonderful empire has been for all the people in the colonies. And of course, it's very important that we know about these histories, because a lot of the wider public are obviously antagonistic to the presence of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people here. But as is being said, we are here because you were there. If you were not in the colonies, we would not have been in Britain. And if you've heard of the Windrush Scandal, why did people come from the Caribbean to Britain? Why did people from India come to Britain? Why did people like myself from East Africa come to Britain? We were in East Africa, because my parents come from India, from Goa, which was a Portuguese colony. And they also worked for the British. They brought to Britain, they brought to Africa to work in Africa, and then got British passports. And after independence, East Africa, we had the right to come to Britain. But a lot of people don't know this, because they wonder, why are you here? And I often have to explain this story. So yes, it's not in the history. My kids, I've got 4 sons who've all been to the curriculum in this country, the education system in this country. It's not being taught in this country. And neither, should I say, was it ever taught to me when I was a schoolgirl in Africa. We were taught the British curriculum. I learned about the Tudors and Stuarts. I certainly didn't learn anything else. I learned domestic science and how to cook a cake in an oven, although we didn't have oven. So the curriculum was very wrong then. I think the curriculum in the West, to go back to the point made the question, is very limited and certainly needs to be broadened so that there's a wider perspective. And the stories of women such as Noor and Sophia are brought to the public via the children in the first instance, but also to the wider public.
Thank you, thank you. Just going back to Sophia, do you know whether she was subjected to any forms of racism, or was her father's relationship with Queen Victoria so strong that she was kind of shielded from any kind of racism?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, actually, because there was a lot of interest in Sophia and interest in her family. Now, unfortunately, her father, Dulip, led a very extravagant life. And in fact, he had a very famous house in Elvedon, which he decorated, furnished it internally, almost like a Mughal palace. And he invited the aristocracy to come and visit him there. And he also had a large number of infidelities. Now, Dulip was married, Sophia's father married. In fact, Queen Victoria was involved in trying to matchmake and getting him to marry an aristocratic woman. But he didn't. In fact, he married a woman when he was in Cairo. He married a woman who was an illegitimate daughter of a German merchant and an Ethiopian slave mistress. And this is the woman he married. She was very beautiful, and she was brought to England, and she lived with him in England, and they had several children. He also had various other children to other relationships. And unfortunately, he died in impoverished circumstances. Dulip's brothers were also involved in, oops, sorry, that's my time again, were also involved in activities that were not of the best. So in her case, and Sophia was to some extent shielded from this, but she always had these backstories about her father talked about, and she was embarrassed by that. But she was never, in all the time when she was in Britain and she was involved in suffragette movement, never thrown out of Hampton Court. Can you imagine? The king was so worried about the stories reaching the papers about the goddaughter of Queen Victoria being kicked out of Hampton Court, even though they didn't like what she was doing. They didn't like her involved in various activities. So she might well have, in fact, her sisters, Bamba and Catherine, were not as, did not like the British that much. They thought that there was a lot of discrimination which they experienced. And in fact, her sister Bamba went to live in India. She preferred to live in India. So yes, there were elements of racism, but they might well have been muted, I think.
Yeah, okay. Another question for you from Mary. How do you think these two women would have responded to the challenges in our present time? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but...
Yes, I think it's very interesting in Sophia's case. It's her change in her. I mean, at first she was very much a thoroughly English girl, I think was one term that was used to describe her because of the way she dressed, the way she acted, her involvement in aristocratic circles, etc. And then she changed, became more radical and militant when she saw what was happening in India. And I think now she would say, and in fact, we know that the Sikhs here have been talking a lot, as some of you probably know. In 1947, there was a partition of India into Pakistan and India, and the Punjab was divided in those two areas. And it's created a lot of tension, a lot of problems. And there's a lot of discussion about returning of the Koh-i-Noor diamonds. So I think there would be talk about it. There would be concerns. If I would certainly be concerned about ancestral lands. Her father tried his best to get them back, and they wouldn't give it back to him. So there was a lot of disenchantment with what had actually happened to them when Dulip was very young, a boy king, and Sophia obviously didn't know about it at the time, and then she was living in Britain. I think Noor definitely would have been very concerned about what was going on. She would have seen what large numbers of Black and Asian troops were involved. They were involved not just in the armies, but in various other activities, and how often they were in the vanguard of a lot of the very terrible things that were happening. And even after the war, many of them, in fact, if you see David Olasaga's documentaries about this, he talks about the World's War, when he talks about troops who were brought to even work in the trenches to clear up the mess after the war had finished. And in fact, in France, there is a grave where there are a lot of Chinese people who were brought over to help. And many of them helped as engineers and to repair the armored vehicles. And there's a grave that to all of them who, well, individual ones where people have died. So yes, I think Noor would have wanted to see more recognition of Black lives that were lost at that time. And certainly she'd want Black lives to matter. And I think she'd be strongly campaigning for that, as would the rest of her family.
Amazing, thank you. I'm also, another question for you. Were there a lot of Asian people in France at the outbreak of the Second World War?
I think the Second World War, there would have been, and if there were certainly people of Indian origin from Southeast Asia might have been there. You know, at the end of the colonies, a lot of people who were from the colonies would have come back, quotes, the motherland. Certainly, I think in more recent times, there have been people there. But of course, there were lots of American soldiers as well, Black American soldiers who were in France. And many of them, in fact, were quite amazed at the reception they got from the French, because, you know, many of them came from the American South, and there they couldn't talk to white women. You know, all the lynchings and all those activities have been going on in the South of America. But in France, they were able to. But there was a different form of racism that they experienced. But the music that they brought was also appreciated. So there were a large number of people. And of course, a lot of people who came from Algeria, the former colonies, who came to live in France, from Morocco as well. But there wouldn't have been as many South Asians as you would find in Britain, because South Asia wasn't a colony of France, apart from Pondicherry, which was, so most of India was under the British. You had Goa, where I come from, which is under the Portuguese for a very, very long time, over 450 years, and only gained its independence in 1961. And Pondicherry, which was a small enclave, which was run by the French in India. So you wouldn't get that many going to France. Most of them would have come to Britain.
Thank you. And we're almost out of time. Can you just give us just a quick reminder of where we can do some more reading about these incredible women?
Yes, so I think they should have been posted on the chat. A few references which I've gathered together. There's many more. There's also a video clip of the memorial service when Noor's bust was commemorated in 2012. So there is a video clip that you can have a look at. And certainly those books would be a starting point. There are many, many more which I've read, but I didn't think a very comprehensive list was required. And my own book is also mentioned there if anybody's interested in finding out about colonialism, migration, and international Catholic going. There's certainly my books mentioned in there as well.
Great, thank you so much, Stella. Thank you. There's lots of people saying thank you, very illuminating and also relevant. Thank you for this fascinating talk. Yeah, so it's been really, really interesting.
Well, I'm delighted to have given it. I hope I brought something to life. And I've given my email address as well in that sheet of paper with the references. If anybody wants to contact me further, you know, I could talk about these things for hours, actually. I've really, really abbreviated it, and it's really been a quick canter through. But by all means, I'm happy to talk further about these wonderful women and wider issues as well.
Great. I'm just very quickly going to repost your original chat, just with all those references for those that perhaps joined a little bit late. Just give me a second, everybody, and I will pop that in now. Here we go. There you go. And thank you again, Stella.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming and listening to this. It's for those of you whose friends wanted to come. I know a number of you got in touch. I believe it's been recorded. It's on Migration Matters website. It's on Facebook, live streamed, and also Vimeo, which is another platform. So there'll be an opportunity to listen for those who missed it today, or any if you want to listen again. You know, I'd be delighted to have your comments as well. So do send me comments through my email address. I haven't looked through the chat, I must admit. I've been too busy chatting, too busy talking.
Well, I've posted your email address as well again for at the end of the chat, Stella. So thank you once again. and enjoy the rest of the festival.
And thank you very much, Migration Matters, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye all.
Thank you very much for joining us for this Migration Matters Festival online event. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to make a donation, please visit migrationmattersfestival.co.uk/donate. Your donation will make a difference. Thank you.